Good afternoon in New York, good evening in Europe and Israel, and welcome whatever time of day or night it is for those joining us from the rest of the world. I'm Yael Danieli, founder and executive director of the International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multigenerational Legacies of Trauma, ICMGLT for short. Thank you for joining our webinar on Cohering Multigenerational Histories to Repair the World. In observance of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the 77th anniversary of liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the Nazi concentration and death camps in Poland. Built on the ashes of the Holocaust, in the words of its charter, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which has brought untold sorrow to, it says mankind, I changed it to humanity. On 1 November 2005, the United Nations designated February 27, quotes, to educate, remember and honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims and survivors of Nazi persecution. Tragically, today's confluence of threats, near and far, challenges us almost daily to yet again resiliently hold the promise of never again without giving in to despair. Following ICMGLT style, today we have a multidisciplinary international panel of Holocaust survivors' offspring who will present 3 disparate works published during the last decade and reflect on the distinct histories, methodologies, and lessons they have learned during their journeys and since their publications. Your moderator is a clinical psychologist, victimologist, and traumatologist who has devoted much of her career to studying, treating, and preventing multi-generational impacts of massive trauma, to victims' rights, and to reparative justice. Our first presenter, Karen Baum Gordon, has just published, quotes, The Last Letter, A Father's Struggle, A Daughter's Quest, and the Long Shadow of the Holocaust. A graduate of Harvard College and Columbia Business School, Karen co-founded Strategic Horizons, an executive coaching and management consulting firm, and serves on the faculty of the Media Transformation Challenge program of the Poynter Institute. A Dallas native, she is the proud mother of 2 sons and has recently served as president of Brooklyn Heights Synagogue. Michal, our second presenter, is the Stuart Z. Katz Professor of Humanities at CCNY, where she chairs the English department, directs the Rifkin Center for the Humanities and the Arts, and serves as core faculty at the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity. Michal will speak of her magnificently reviewed latest book, In the East, How My Father and 250,000 Polish Jews Survived the Holocaust, formerly published as Tehran Children, a Holocaust Refugee Odyssey, translated into German and Hebrew. 4 days ago, right in time for this webinar, CUNY's Board of Trustees named Michal Distinguished Professor. Mazal tov, Michal.
Mazal tov.
Michal Kishka grew up in Belgium and emigrated to Israel at the age of 19. He studied graphic design at the renowned Jerusalem Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design, where he teaches as professor of illustration, comics, and political cartoon. A member of the International Association Cartooning for Peace, he received the Israeli Dosh Cartoon Award, was decorated Chevalier des Arts de Lettres by France Minister of Culture, King Leopold Order from Belgium, and Bernheim Award by the Fondation du Judaisme Française. His first graphic novel, second generation, second generation, Things I Did Not Tell My Father, was published in 9 languages, including German and Polish. Its animated film adaptation will be released in May 2022. His second, Falafel with Hot Sauce, about his aliyah and life in Israel, will be followed by the upcoming 1 kilometer 4 seasons. Married to Olivia Alfandari, they have 3 sons, David, Jonathan, and Eli, and 4 grandchildren, Emily, Nina, Leonard, and Luciane. We have about an hour and a quarter for the webinar. Each speaker will talk for about 12 minutes. Following an interchange among us, I will open the floor to questions or brief comments from the virtual audience. Panelists will then conclude with what we call last words. Please use the chat function and we'll do our best to respond to as many as we can. Feel free to direct your questions to a particular panelist or to the full panel. I give the screen floor to Karen Baum Gordon. Karen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yael, for pulling this together. And I feel honored to share this with Michal and Michal. Try saying that 10 times fast. That's a lot, but really I feel very honored to share it with both of you. Let me start by sharing the top line really of my father's story. My father, Rudy Baum, emigrated to this country in 1936 to the US from Frankfurt, Germany at the age of 21. He then joined the American Army, became a naturalized citizen, and participated in the liberation of Buchenwald as part of Patton's army. His parents perished in the Holocaust in the Łódź Ghetto in Poland. My father, at the age of 86, he was very outgoing. He was very in the world, very full of energy. At the age of 86, he attempted suicide and wrote a note that said, "I am a tortured soul." He went on to live for 7 years, 7 wonderful years, actually. And after his death, I really was, I felt compelled to understand what was underneath. What was this tortured soul? What was that? And one of his very dear friends, who also was from Frankfurt, had said to me, it was the Holocaust underneath it all. It was the Holocaust underneath. So of course, trying to understand took me not only back to my father, but to my grandparents. I had 88 letters professionally translated that were from his mother, written from his mother to him, as well as poured through archival documents and went back to Frankfurt 3 times and to Łódź once. In that journey, there were ordinary people helping an ordinary person like me. And one such person I actually met on the internet, and this is in 2009. I was really interested in knowing what was the exact date and circumstance of my grandfather's death. My father never knew that. So in my trying to understand that, I had gone on to the internet looking, and on the US Holocaust Museum website was a video panel of 4 survivors of the ghetto. And I thought, Oh, I bet maybe they have been in search of people themselves or helped other people find people. I did use good old fashioned whitepages.com. I looked each of them up. I left a phone message for each. I did a little research about them to understand. And there I was in October 2009, having breakfast with 3 girlfriends before my business day started in Le Pen Quotidien in Manhattan. My phone rings with a 914 area code that I didn't recognize. And at the other end of the line was Dr. Solimea Cape, one of the 4 panelists. With her very high-pitched Julia Child-like voice with a Polish accent, she says, "Yes, my dear, how can I help you?" So we proceed to talk for an hour, and she tells me she remembers the exact day that the Jews from Frankfurt came into the ghetto. She herself was born in Łódź. She was an inhabitant of the Łódź ghetto, and she went to medical school in Łódź right after the war. She was now a retired anesthesiologist living in Larchmont, just outside of New York City. We proceed to talk more, and then I say to her at one point, "So Dr. Cape, you know, the story that you wrote, the one about being in medical school where the cadaver was the body of the commandant, was that true?" And she was incensed and said, "Oh, of course it's true. I don't write anything that's not true." And I thought, okay, I've blown it now. But at the end, I sheepishly asked if she would be willing to have me drive up and have a coffee with her. She said, "No, I come in, we have lunch." The next week we met for lunch. And in a 3.5-hour lunch, she explained to me, you know, if your grandparents perished in the ghetto, there are graves and tombstones for them in the Łódź Jewish cemetery. I was stunned. I said, "If there are graves, I am on the next plane." And she said, "And if you're on the next plane, I will go with you. It will make it easier for you." Thinking, easier for me? Wow. And we ended up going together the next spring. She, her then 46-year-old son, I, and my then 20-year-old and 17-year-old sons. So that was extraordinary. And so many people along the way helped me like that. And along the way, there were many, many emotional, what I would call emotional punches in the gut that occurred. And one such, the very first one, I would say, emotional punch in the gut, was on August 31st, 2009, in the comfort of my own home. The phone rang, and at the other end of the phone was Andy, a dear friend and former professor of a dear friend of mine. He was German born and raised, but lived in this country. And I had asked him to translate a handful of letters. He had already translated the first letter that my grandmother wrote to my father. But much like, you know, I always want to open the present right away, I couldn't wait to know what was in the last letter. I didn't want the letters all 88 and then get to the last one. So he agreed to translate it. He called me quite unexpectedly to translate it real time for me on the phone, which was unbelievable. I started to write down every word he said as he was saying them, ended up a puddle of tears. I trekked downstairs in our home, and there was my husband and younger son watching a Yankees versus the Baltimore Orioles game. They paused, taking one look at my face, and I proceeded to read through my blurred vision of my tears exactly what I had just learned. They gave me a hug. I went upstairs and thought, I'm calling it a day. I just want to crawl into bed. So I always like to read before I go to sleep. And I thought, I'm going to crack open this book that I just received, which was, it's actually the Chronicle of the Łódź Ghetto. As you can see, 500 pages plus. It's a diary. The Germans had asked some of the Jewish inhabitants to write a diary of what was going on in the ghetto. And then there was an underground version of it. And normally I would look at the index, the table of contents, look at the pictures, but for this book, I wanted to savor every word. I started with the introduction, paragraph 1. The introduction, the editors were trying to explain the layout of the book and how it worked. And they say, we're picking a date, May 4th, 1942. The weather is always reported first. It was such and such. And then they proceed to give a few details. The last line of the paragraph introduction, page 1, paragraph 1, is, and on this day, Julie Baum, my grandmother, hung herself. So I knew that my grandmother had died by suicide in the ghetto because my father had learned it from this very same book only a few years earlier. But there it was unexpectedly on that page. And I just thought, wow, I am meant to keep on going. The universe is talking to me. And I did keep going for a good 10 years. And what I have learned along the way has been unbelievable, has been healing, has been emotionally gut-wrenching at times. But I feel like I keep on learning, whether it's in talking about the book now, people are putting together pieces that I hadn't put together in such a way, or a conversation I had as recently as last month with Rabbi David Stern, who is the rabbi of the synagogue I grew up in Dallas, Texas. He said to me, you know, what makes your book different is that it's about surviving the surviving. With survivors, we want to be attaboy, attagirl, you know, you made it, you did it, you got past it, you made a life for yourself. We want to hear the inspiration, not the pain. And I think in my father's case, that's certainly the case. He was surviving the surviving. I don't know how he went back to Buchenwald and helped to liberate that. I don't know how he filed restitution papers where he had to defend again and again and again what he felt he was owed. I don't know how he stumbled upon a video of himself in the US Holocaust Museum of that day of liberation in Buchenwald. And I can only say growing up, for me, it was in the house. He didn't talk about it a lot. He spoke about it in later years a great deal. But growing up, if asked a question, he would answer. There were 2 yahrzeit candles lit the same day every year for his parents. That was unusual. In the photo albums, the family photo albums stuck in the cabinet, in between was an album of the liberation of Buchenwald with very disturbing pictures. So it was physically in the house, but it was there. And even though not spoken, you know, as Jung says, it's not necessarily what the spoken problems or challenges are of the parent, it's the unspoken. And I think the impact for me is that with this lineage of suicide in my family, I didn't set out to write a book, it evolved to be a book. And I think the journey for me has been to dilute, as is the name of this center, the generation of trauma being passed on, to somehow break the chain, to lessen it. And it shows up for me in my keeping of traditions, in my thinking about the complexity of my own identity as a Jew, as an American. It shows up for me in little mind games every day. You know, if there's a challenge or an anxiety about something small or big, I think, God, you know, when I think about what my grandparents went through or my father, this really is not a big deal. This is not a big deal. So it's very present for me. I believe that the remembering is so important for all of us. Those of you who are joining us, I would urge you to have the conversations with those around you or in your past to find out more. And if they need a forum to talk about the pain, to do that as well, but to have the conversations and to do the research. And if they've passed away, then it's not too late to do the research. It's there and it's easily accessible, the information. So with that, I'm going to share just a very few photos because I know 12 minutes is it. And so I'm going to share my screen really quickly. I promise it will be quick. And I'm going to share just a handful of photos to bring to life what I just spoke of. So here is my father as I remember him at the age of 86. This is actually 3 months after his suicide attempt. He's at our oldest son's bar mitzvah, and really remarkable. And here he is enjoying life 2 years before he emigrated at the age of 18 on the left and 19 on the right. This is 1933 and 1944, you know, happy, living life. And these are my parents when my father was in the army, and they had just gotten married, and he was about to be shipped off abroad to Europe for the liberation. And here is talk about surviving the surviving. I mean, this picture to me says it all. This is the liberation of Buchenwald. He's pointing to himself. That picture is in my book, but this is him at the Dallas Holocaust Museum with a smile on his face. This is the inspirational part. He is surviving the surviving with a smile. And here are my grandparents. They sent these pictures in 1938 to my father, I think is trying to prove everything was fine. That bracelet that my grandmother's wearing in the lower left is indeed this bracelet, which is remarkable and incredible. And here's just a bit of examples to say that the research is accessible. On the upper left is the front cover of the restitution papers that my father and his sister filed. I got those out of the Hessian archives in Germany. In the middle is an example of a letter, and on the right is an address book in the Frankfurt Jewish Museum. I poured through some of those address books with the archivist. And these are also accessible. The American Red Cross Tracing Service. I wanted to find out as much as I could. On the upper left there is that. On the right is the manifest of the ship my father came over on, which I found on Ancestry.com. And the bottom is a copy of the transmigration voucher I also found on Ancestry.com, where my father was putting funds in to save, to be able to bring his parents over. And lastly, it was a family affair. On the left is a memorial plaque that we erected. Those are my sons and myself at the Wutch Jewish Cemetery, because there were unmarked graves for my grandparents. And on the right, my husband, Bob, and sons at the Frankfurt Jewish Cemetery. That's my great-grandparents' tombstone. And at the end of the day, it's really about, here are my grandparents in their memory and my father's memory, my grandmother, Julie, my grandfather, Norbert, and the Stolperstein, the brass plaques that were placed in front of their home in the way of memory. So with that, I so appreciate your attention, and I'm going to hand it back to Yael. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Next is distinguished Professor Michal Deckley.
Thank you. You can call me. You can still call me Michal.
I know.
Yeah. Also, I mean, I'm actually thinking about Karen's presentation, and I mean, already so many things resonate, including this idea of surviving the and I'm not even sure. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the word survivor lately, and whether it's even an adequate word. I think in Hebrew, people have started saying soed, not nitzol. So soed is, I don't know, I guess somebody who just kind of remained alive after this, but there's no kind of happy ending. I think it's a less happy word, and I think it's more appropriate. But anyway, we can talk about that later. But wonderful to be here with Michal and Karen and Yael. I feel like I was telling the panelists before, I've done maybe, I don't know, 50 talks, 60 talks on Zoom, I don't know, some crazy number, and I, you know, I can't stand them anymore, except in something like this, where you actually get to talk with smart people and you get to meet an international audience. That's just really a privilege. So my book, like Karen and Michal's, is also about my fathers. We have 3 fathers here, but unlike Karen and Michal, I didn't grow up thinking of my father as a Holocaust survivor. And this is not because he hid his past, he didn't talk about his past, but he didn't hide it. I knew that he lived through the war, but my father's story was not considered in my youth in Israel, where I was born and raised, as a Holocaust story. And it's still not exactly told as part of the Holocaust narrative that's told, for example, in the Holocaust Museum in Washington and so on. My father, I'm actually going to share some slides with you as I'm talking. Sorry, I just want to make it slideshow view. Okay, so my father, Hanan Deckel, was part of a group that was, he was born in Poland. He was part of a group that was evacuated to mandatory Palestine through Iran, and it's part of the group called the Tehran Children, Yaldei Tehran in Hebrew. And when I was, growing up, and this is in Haifa in the 1970s and 80s, the Tehran children were not Holocaust survivors. Holocaust survivors were those people who had tattoos on their forearms, who survived in Nazi camps, who were hidden children, who had accents, who came to speak at Holocaust Memorial Day at our schools. And they had a certain recognizable aura about them, and they were all around it. I mean, I grew up in Haifa, in the Carmel. It was, completely Ashkenazi area, and almost everybody's family had parents, grandparents were survivors. My father, to me, was an Israeli. He was an Air Force man, Israeli Air Force man. He spoke perfect Hebrew. And he never once in my whole childhood was invited to any kind of Holocaust commemoration about his past. And yet there was a puzzle about him. There was something enigmatic and aloof, something formal and distant. He had bouts of unexplained anger. He isolated himself at times. He would kind of lock himself up in the bedroom and just wouldn't show up for dinner for for a long time. I mean, and I write about this in the book. I mean, we were 6 at home. My maternal grandmother lived with us, and in our home there were 2 camps. It was sort of my father and his mother, and my Israeli-born mother, and us children. I have 2 younger siblings. So I was close to my father. This is my father and me, I don't know, I guess I'm like maybe a year and a half or something here. I was close to him, but I was always uneasy around him. And when I came to New York, and stayed here, in some ways I couldn't get far away from him enough, and start a life that was, I don't know, I guess less complicated, more light, with less, not carrying that kind of burden. And I came to New York and I got a PhD in literature, and I taught, and I still teach in an English department, and I worked on British Romanticism, and I was very, I mean, it's not that I cut myself off, but I was in many ways disconnected from him, from the family, from Israel, and from the Jewish past. And fast forward to 2007, I'm at a faculty party at my university, and I'm speaking to an Iranian colleague, and my Iranian colleague, the novelist Salar Abdas, says to me, do you know anything about Jewish children who were refugees in Iran during the war? He had just read about this in an Iranian newspaper. And I say, well, I can believe this. My father was one of these children. And he said to me, what, when, how? And I didn't really know anything. And that's really was the start of this really crazy decade-long search, quest, decade-long odyssey across Poland, Russia, Siberia, Central Asia, Israel. My colleague researched for me in Iran several times, and in archives really all over the world, in Warsaw, in Moscow, in Komi, in Stanford, in London, in Bnei Brak, in Harod, and the list goes on. And like Karen said, there was something kind of addictive, right? I mean, all of a sudden you realize that you actually, what you thought you couldn't know, you can know. And you just become very engrossed in this. And at the end of this really crazy, and I should say that I also, I traveled a large part of their journey. So if you look at this map and if you see, it's kind of incredible. It's 13,000 miles. It goes from Ostromozowiecka, where my father was born, into Siberia, in Arkhangelsk, all the way down to southern Soviet Empire, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, from there through the Caspian Sea to Bandar Pahlavi, to Iran, Tehran, and then through the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, the Suez Canal into Egypt, and then into Palestine. So it was an odyssey that my father took over 3.5 years, and it was an odyssey that I took part of over many, many years. At the end of this intense journey came this book, Tehran Children, which was published just before the pandemic in October 2019. And it just came out with a different title, and I can tell you why later. What?
Yes.
In a paperback, it just came out last month. It was just published by W.W. Norton. So writing this book repaired in many ways my imagined relationship with my father. And I say imagined because my father sadly passed away many years before I even began to work on this book. Although I do think probably, he passed away from mad cow disease. And we actually now think that it could be very well something that he ate, as a starving boy in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan. But still my research helped solve the riddle that was the catalyst for the book. Who was this man? And of course it also helped, on the kind of level of our family. I mean, my siblings, my cousins, I just like 5 minutes before this panel started, I got a call from a distant cousin who just read the book, and he was just like, oh my God, I didn't even know my mom's name was Emma before the war, which he learned from my book. So that definitely has really repaired. It connected the dots, and it connected the dots not only about what my father went through during the war, but who he was before the war. Who was this person who is in Poland, who is sort of chubby, who is sort of proud, who's very self-confident, who's from a family that was the wealthiest and most prominent and biggest clan in their little town in Poland. I don't know this person because the person that raised me was not this person. That person had already lost all those qualities and that past and those people. And so so I know him now, and I have reclaimed some of that past, emotionally, psychologically speaking. Unfortunately, I haven't reclaimed their property or anything like that, and I won't be able to either in Poland. But this is, by the way, they were owners of a very large beer brewery, and this is the brewery, which then the brewery later became Gestapo headquarters during the war and so on. But the book that I wrote ended up being not just about my father and not just about these 1,000 or so Tehran children. It ended up being a book, amazingly, of most Polish Jewish survivors. Most Polish Jewish survivors, meaning about 250,000, survived not in Nazi-occupied Poland or elsewhere where 90% of the people died, or more than 90%, but in the areas of the Soviet occupation, not on the border, but basically in the Soviet interior and in the Soviet Central Asian republics, where the Nazis didn't get far enough to kill them. They were survived by their deportations. And so I ended up writing the story of most Polish Jewish survivors, a story which has not been told as a story until then. more or less. I mean, there were some memoirs, but nobody actually put the story together in this way. And most of these people survived in Central Asia. My grandparents did as well. And a minority, like my father and his sister, you see them in their photo, in the photo here. In the photo here is my grandfather from left to right, my grandfather, my aunt, my father, and my father's uncle, who, you know, probably died in Treblinka. We don't know exactly. And so in researching the details of my personal story of my father, I ended up telling the story of all these other people, and as well as the story, of course, of myself and my own travel and meditation, what I found. And so when Tehran Children was published, I didn't really, you know, I wrote my book the way academics write their book, you know, in our sweatpants in the library at 2 a.m. And then the book came out and it got reviewed in the New York Times, and it became, and all of a sudden people started writing me, and people were writing me, oh my God, I didn't, I can't believe this story. I didn't know, I always knew that my father was in Uzbekistan. I thought he was the only one. Now, I just told you that there were about 250,000 people in this story, and a person can think that their father was the only one. And that really brought home to me the importance of writing these books and collecting, not only collecting this history, but this books like ours help other people write their histories. And so it gives them some kind of roadmap. And, you know, I mean, I had realized, and then a lot of people contacted me, and I had realized that, you know, how much we take for granted. You know, we already have Primo Levi, we already have Elie Wiesel, we already have Art Spiegel. When we were writing our books, we already had all this information and models out there. But if you're writing a book in a way about your father who is in Uzbekistan, or your grandmother who says, she suffered from sexual violence or something, and you're thinking, are they making it up or they're not, you know, and you don't, because you don't have the Elie Wiesel of the Gulag of the story, or the Primo Levi of the story, or the Art Spiegel of the story, and you need that in order to be able to tell other stories. I mean, this is this photo here is from, I mean, the book was written about in the New York Review of Books about a month ago, I don't know, 2 months ago, by Ruth Franklin. Ruth Franklin's grandparents were also deported and went through this journey. And she wrote me, and I helped her connect her with people who can help her. And she writes in her piece, she writes, "It is startling to discover in a book written by a stranger answers you have always been seeking, even unconsciously, to the most fundamental personal questions of your life." And so I do think that our books, all of our books in a way, do that, answer questions that other people have about their own lives. And in that sense, there is that sense of community is something very, very reparative. And I guess, you know, in that vein, so I mean, I think, and maybe this is also connects to what Karen said, that finding that sense of community in some ways is breaking the cycle of loneliness, right? Of the survivor, of definitely how my father was so reserved, and I mean, I don't think he was a person who ever asked for help in his life. So the very fact that other people are helping you, and is already reparative, helping you in and being witness to your search. And in that sense, I want to say that to me also my journey was reparative in, I don't know how to put it exactly, but I would say maybe connecting to the non-Jewish world in some way, because the kind of research that I did, because it was in places where either I couldn't travel or they were dangerous to travel to. I mean, Uzbekistan, you can't really travel there as an independent researcher and just say, take me to the KGB archives. And they're like, sure, please come. I mean, you need some oligarch who will help you get permission to pay this one. So a lot of people help me, and this was my research assistant in Uzbekistan, Salar in Iran, and so on. And those people have their own histories of trauma in one way or another, all of these people, because a lot of times that's how you connect to people. I mean, Salar, for example, was a child refugee of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So those bonds, and they're sometimes complicated bonds. I mean, those relationships are not necessarily easy always, and have not been for me. But they are a form of repair, in the sense that I would say that my father had the Holocaust had put my father in almost like a political and emotional bunker, maybe, is the metaphor. And this search helped me to pull myself and my siblings and other people, hopefully, out of that bunker to an extent. And that has been reparative. So these are my preliminary remarks. These are, and I too, I think, like Karen, connected to a lot of, again, to not only to children, but to actual survivors of this story. People are actually alive who went through this journey. And one of the most amazing things is that because they have not had a story, they have documents, photos, diaries that they've never given to anyone because they didn't know who to give it to. So they didn't send it to Yad Vashem so they sent them to me, and then I was able to facilitate, other museums getting them. And they're sort of all my friends now. And these two wonderful men here, unfortunately, very sadly, Henry Lando on the left died last year. Their father wrote an amazing diary memoir, and now I'm helping them publish his memoir. So there is a community on many, many different levels, and I'm just thrilled to be part of that, and to be, in some ways, to be the center of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michal. And now the floor belongs to Michal Kiska. Please, Michal.
Thank you very much. Okay, so in Jerusalem, I should say good evening, but to most of you, I'll say good afternoon. I'm going to tell you about my graphic novel, Second Generation, Things I Did Not Tell My Father, but it's more not the content of the book, but more the process of the making of the book, and the life of the book after it was published, and that my father read. Okay, so as Yael said, and thank you, Yael, for your invitation, and thank you also, Karen and Michal, for your lectures. Karen, we have a lot in common. My father was liberated from Buchenwald too.
Wow.
So I grew up as a happy boy. I wanted to be a cowboy when I was a kid. I was born in Belgium in 1954. And I was happy probably because I was born happy and because I knew nothing about my family story, probably. And I was a comics lover. As a kid, I read my first book at my bar mitzvah. Until my bar mitzvah, I read only comics. My father was desperate that I was not reading books. And Belgium was at that time, until today, a land of comics. And one of the comics I discovered in my father's library is a comics on the war, the Second World War, with such frames, okay? It was a Disney style for kids telling about the Second World War. And to me, because I knew nothing about my father, I was all the time looking in his library. He had books on the Holocaust in 3 or 4 languages because he spoke French, Dutch, German, and English, and also Yiddish, but he had no books in Yiddish. And I was looking after photos, after document, to try to understand what he was unable to tell us. We were 4 kids. And Belgium at that moment was really a kingdom of comics. Tintin, you probably all know of it, but I read it when I was 6 years old, and until today I read also comics. And I knew since I was 6 that this is what I want to do in life, actually. I emigrated at the age of 19 to Israel at the end of February. That would be exactly 48 years. And one day, I walked the street of Jerusalem Center. I live in Jerusalem. And on the library, I found a bookshop. I found this book, the first volume, okay? A Survivor's Tale. I did not know about Art Spiegelman. 86, we had no internet yet. So I entered the shop because I was attracted by discover what as though those two mice and this swastika with Hitler and the name Maus in German, what is it inside? Because it had also the format of a book, not of a comics. And when I opened it and I discovered that was a comics, I bought it. And I went out of the shop, I sat on a bank in the street and I read it. And it took me 2 hours to finish the first volume. It's a little more than 150 pages. And I was under shock because that was the first time in my life that I read a comics that was not done for kids. It was not funny. It was not adventure. It was not heroes or superheroes. That was an autobiographical story on the Holocaust and of a relationship between a son and his father, a survivor, as if it was me. And to me, that was the day the seeds was planted in my mind that one day I'll do my book too, because I had the feeling that Spiegelman has opened a new field in the field of comics, which is true. Today, the field of graphic novels is very productive all over the world. So it was 86. I was probably the first reader of the book in all Israel, probably the only buyer of it. But to me, because I felt that Art Spiegelman and me have shared the same experience, and because we are both of us comics lovers, it had to me a very deep effect. Actually, it took me 25 years to do my book, because at that stage, I was a young man, I was 32, married with 3 boys. I knew nothing about my family history, nothing. All what we knew at home, that my father was in the camps and he lost all his family and he's the only survivors. These 3 sentences were all what we knew about him. I even never read his number on his arm when I was a kid. I couldn't say, what is his number? Now, in our family, we had a family photo album, and there was only one family photo of the Kishkas. My father is on the right, his parents and his 2 younger sisters. This photo was shot by a street photographer in Brussels in 1938, 2 years before the Nazi occupation, and they are all happy. And this is the only photo I had of the family together. My father was born in Belgium. His parents emigrated from Poland after the First World War. Separately, they were not married in Poland. Same for my mother's parents. They were all Polish that emigrated, moved to Belgium after the First World War. So my father was born as a Polish refugee in Belgium. We, his kids, were the first to be born as Belgians. When he was liberated from Buchenwald, his survival is a miracle. Okay, I think that his will to live was so strong, and he was young and strong. He was 16 when he was arrested, and he was liberated 4 days before he was 19. He was sent back to Belgium to a sanatorium, and he began to draw cartoons because he wanted to be a cartoonist. I never saw those cartoons when I was a kid. I saw them probably 20 years ago. One day, I got a letter from Belgium with the cartoons that he kept in a drawer in his room, and he said, they are yours, which means I became a cartoonist without knowing that that was what my father wanted to be. So in my book, one of the pages shows a memory that I have, a strong memory that I keep from my early childhood, is when my father one day drew me a funny Nazi on a paper, walking with a pea pot in his head, being instead of a helmet, and he looked ridiculous. And I was laughing at all the details he was drawing. So I think that was a very strong moment of transmission. When I grew up, you see, it's May 1667. It was exactly 3 months before my bar mitzvah. What I was doing was looking after cartoons in the books that he had on the Holocaust. And he had a book of the funniest cartoons published in the British and American press during the war against Hitler. And I was simply copying the cartoons that were making me laugh. So I was in the same time training my hand to copy, like, you know, all the young artists who copy their masters. And I also understood the technique of what makes a cartoon funny. So I have kept some of them, and they were probably my first steps as the future cartoonist that I became. So we grew up. This is me and my father. I don't know, I was probably 4. This is the 4 of us. My father wanted 4 kids, and he said my mother, the day they married, that he wants 4 kishka to replace the 4 that he lost. This is why we were 4. My father kept silent. I grew up, I can say, normally, or I thought I grew up normally. When I emigrated to Israel and I married and I grew up my own kids, we have 3 boys and today also 4 granddaughters. Yael has presented all of them in her introduction. My father began to talk in 88. Why 88? Because in 88, my younger brother, Charlie, suicided. We also have a suicide in the family, like the story that you told us, Karen. And on that day, we did not know he was so desperate. He was the 4th one. I traveled from Israel to his funeral. He was buried in Belgium. He lived in France and was married. So my sister, who was living in a kibbutz, my elder sister and me, we traveled to Belgium to participate to the funeral and to the Shiva, to the week of the morning after the funerals. And what I had in mind, that we are going to sit and to evoke his memory, to talk about Charlie, to watch photos and to be together and to prepare ourselves, or to prepare myself to go back to life little by little. And it did not happen. What happened is the book I'm going to tell you. Because my father actually, during this week, instead of talking about my brother, for the first time publicly, we were a lot of people around him in their living room in Brussels, he began to tell history during the war. And I was sitting around with all our friends who were our friends since we were kids. And I was shocked. I was shocked that my father has chosen this moment to tell history, and I was totally unable to listen to him. But I could not say anything. I could not say, Father, please stop, not now. It's not the good timing. We are here for Charlie, not for you. This is what I wanted to say, but I kept it for myself because I could not say such a sentence to my father, a survivor who has suffered so much. How can I tell him this? So he wrote a book of what happened to him in 2004, an adolescence lost in the night of the camps. He became an official speaker after my brother's funeral. He was invited by the Minister of Education to talk in high schools in Belgium, and he did it for the next 25 years. He was retired, and every week he had 3 or 4 schools. They were taking him from his home and bringing him back, and he was talking. and he became a wonderful speaker. And somehow, those people who met him knew actually the new Henry Kiszka. The Henry Kiszka that was our father when we were kids was a silent man. He was a silent, broken victim. And little by little, by talking, he became a hero, a war hero. And he became known, honored, respected, decorated. He was also recorded by the team of Spielberg, and his book was translated to Polish, and he took classes to Auschwitz and Birkenau, and he was meeting officials of the Belgian government. He became someone, because in the camp, he was just a number who was supposed to disappear. And when he came back to Belgium after the war, no one looked at him. And so the process of reconstruction of my father is something that in my work of reflection on the past, on our family life, my introspection of what happened to our family, I understood that this process brought him to be a man who finds back his dignity. But to me, let's say that my trauma, if I can say, is not the Holocaust. I was not there. My trauma was the loss of my younger brother. We were very close. We slept in the same room all the years. And to me, my understanding, I'm not a searcher and I'm not a scientist, and this is not my field of specialty, Holocaust and post-trauma. But to me, to my understanding, there was a connection between the past of my father and the present of my brother, because we were different. And in the book, I began writing memories in a personal diary to talk to my father indirectly. Until now, I did not say a word on my mother. All her family escaped Belgium, occupied Belgium, and they could cross the border to Switzerland, and they were refugees in Switzerland. This is why she never told us her story, because she told, my Holocaust story is nothing compared to your father's story. So my story does not deserve to be told. Okay, this is why I knew nothing. Now, time was going, and I was getting 45 and 50. When I was 55, I felt that I'm psychologically ready to do my book. And my book would be a comics, a graphic novel, in which I tell my memories and my truths, and in which I try to define, first of all, to myself, what does it mean being a second generation? Because second generation are two words that people, when they hear it, it seems that they understand what it is about. I myself did not understand. What is the difference between a boy who grew up like me and a boy who grew up normally? What are the differences? And because I'm living in Israel for so many years, I discovered around me a lot of people who belong to my generation. And I understood that we have a lot in common. And the most of the thing that we have in common is the way we behaved with our parents, because they have suffered so much. And all the efforts that we did to make them happy, to please them, to behave the way they expected. And in a way, this is what I did all my young life. I wanted my parents to be happy. And I got good grades, and I was a good boy, and I was polite, and I was perfect. I was a model boy, just to please them. And I noticed around me here that so many people I know of my age, more or less, behaved exactly the same. So the book is divided in 3 parts. The first part is my childhood and my teenage in Belgium. The third part in my life in Israel. I'm an adult married with kids. And the middle part, the second part, is the suicide of my brother and what it made me, what happened to me. You can see on the right page, this is the first evening of the Shiva, and I watch a photo album. But my father on the last frame begins to tell his story, and he spoke and spoke and spoke and spoke. This is the page after it. And I stand a little back watching him, and I don't understand what is happening. Why don't we talk about Charlie? I did the trip to separate myself from my brother, not to listen to my father's story. I call it in my book a shitty timing. You will excuse me for the expression, but this is exactly the term I used in French. And I had nightmares sometimes as a kid. This is probably the difference between me and all the kids that I had in school. I was mainly the only Jew in school, at least in my class, when I was a young boy. I lived in Liège, which is not the main city of Belgium, and the Jewish community was small community. So this is the look of the book. It looks like a children's book, but it's not. It's a book for adults. And so I don't tell the Holocaust. I say there are two differences, main differences between Mouse and my book. The masterpiece Mouse, that now was banned in a school in Tennessee, and it increased the sales, which is good, actually. The first difference is that I don't tell the Holocaust, because my father wrote his story in his book. I did not have to tell what happened to my father. I wanted to tell what happened to us, the baby boomers of the afterworld. What is this generation? Is there a post-trauma? And how can we define it? How can I define myself? Because it took me years to understand that I was a second generation. When I grew up until I emigrated, and even years later, I hadn't this, it was not a part of my self-identity. I never wrote anywhere, never told anywhere, I'm a second generation. Today I say it, but today I know what it is, that I can explain it. Now, the book is also, sometimes I let my imagination enter the story, because this is a creation. My memories are my true history, but in my memories, there are also moments of fiction and of imagination, like I never saw my father crying. So I imagine that he cried so much in the camps that he had no tears anymore in his body. And this is a way to illustrate it. And this is, let's say, what art and creation allows you to do. It's not history, it's not research, it's something a little different. And I'm not a Holocaust witness. I'm a second generation, and I can take the liberty, the freedom to do things that are more close to fiction, like this, or like this, for example, okay? This is, okay, the famous Harold Lloyd movie, and I simply do my father hanging on the watch that stopped in 42. A way to say time stopped on the day he was arrested, and he never grew up. All his life was 16, a teenager of 16 who lost everything. This is the way I perceived him, looking at him so deeply for so many times until I did my book. And he wanted me to come with him to one of his visits to Auschwitz. He did it 44 times. I never came. And I tell in the book why I never came. I was telling him on the phone that I'm too busy, and he was believing me. But the truth was that I did not want to go with him, because I had enough of Holocaust in my life, first of all, in one hand. And in the other hand, because he was going with classes, I did not want to be one of the people in the public. I thought that as his son, I deserved something different. And I wanted to hear what he could not write in his book, not what he told the whole world. I'm not the whole world. And I'm not a teenager in a Belgian school. I'm his son. But I also understood he is not able to do that. The book was the maximum he could give. He kept 90% inside of him because things can't be told and they can be believed, I think. This is why at the bottom, I show he and me on the red carpet going to a visit to Auschwitz VIP, okay? This is what I wanted. All the visitors out, just my father and me. It's funny. The book is full of humor, by the way. This is also a difference with Maus. And at the end, I explained to my father the real reasons why I never came with him to Auschwitz. And doing that, I decided that my next step will be to go with him, that I'm ready, that now that the book is done, now that I put on the paper all what I had on my shoulders for so many years, I feel lighter and I feel I'm ready to it. Even with those kids around, I don't care. I'm ready to listen to his speeches, even if it's not personal face-to-face. I end the book by an evening that my father visited us in Jerusalem, and my sister came from her kibbutz to have dinner with us, and we had an evening of Holocaust jokes. Bad Holocaust jokes that made us laugh. Jokes that if a non-Jewish tells them, they are anti-Semitic jokes. If we tell them, they are funny, okay? And that was a wonderful evening. And at the end, I drew an epilogue explaining to the readers the process of postponing this project of the book because I was afraid that my book will shock my father.
Mm-hmm.
I was afraid that when he read it, that he will feel hurted. So I said, I'm not ready yet, I'm not ready yet. And so at that page, I show myself hesitating behind my table, and then my table turned to a plane and I jump with a parachute, which I never did in life. My son did it in the IDF, I never did it. And I have to jump over a field with an empty page of comics. And what looks like a village are my tools. Ink bottles and colors and pens and brushes. And I did it. I did it because my wife, who understood that I need a push, she told me, you talk to everybody that you will do a book, but you don't do a book. And if you ask me, you don't have the guts to do it. And at that moment, I decided to do it. Okay, and this is the last frame of the book. This is me after a night of work with no sleep, unshaved and tired. And I felt so light, so liberated from the burden of this story that I finally told, made a creation out of it. And I go to my first coffee, the smoke of my first coffee. Now the book is published. And I was expecting what would be my father's reaction. And I, frankly, I was 55, I was not a young boy. I was ready that he would dislike it. I told myself, if he likes it, it's wonderful. And if not, I don't care. I didn't do it for him. I did it for me and for my generation. And actually, at first reading, it was not easy to him. It was not easy to him because in Polish Ashkenaz family, we never share feelings and we keep things in the belly. There are so many families with secrets, untold stories, and suddenly I open it to the whole world, black and white on paper in 9 languages. So my father was shocked. But we had 8 years. He died, he passed away in 2020 of COVID-19 in Belgium, in his elderly house. But since 2012 and 2020, 8 years, this book existed between us. And it had a healing effect. And our relationship now became better than ever. I always loved my father. but I did not know him as well as I knew him after I did all this research on him to try to understand him, what happened to him, and his change in life, okay? The victim that became a hero. And these are the translation in Polish and German, and I was invited to Germany and to Poland to present them. And this was very meaningful to me and also to my father. He became so proud of the book that even the things in the book that could hurt him did not hurt him because he was so proud, okay? And that was for me the opportunity to oblige him to listen to us. I mean, the second generation. My father thought, and this is what I explain in his book, my father thought that his silence would protect us. And in the book I say, Father, I can't blame you. I can blame Hitler, not you. But your silence did not protect us. You have to know it, that we have also suffered, not only you. And this is a sentence that was not easy to say, but because the way I said it and because the style I drew it, my father received it in a positive way. And then when he was going to schools or to the camps with his book, he also took mine. He was proud that we have two books signed Kishka, one of the first generation and one of the second generation. So the book was exhibited in Germany and in Poland and in Italy and in France in the Memorial of the Holocaust. And 3 years later, I went to Auschwitz with my father and two of our three sons. And actually that was the last time my father did the trip because he was turning 90 and he was too tired to go on what he did for 25 years, from 65 to almost 90, 3 times a year. And to him, that was very meaningful that 3 generations of Kishka are photographed under Arbeit macht frei. But to me, the significant thing was the process that brought me to the book and the making of the book. This was the real work to me. 2 years later, there was a documentary movie, a German-Polish production on my father and me called Kishka Life is a Cartoon. And that was, I was at the prime screening with my father. I had his hand in my hand for the whole screening. And when he was 90, he came to visit us in Israel. That was his last trip to Israel to celebrate his birthday. And 1 week later, his grandson was born, Leonard. And so my son's wife showed a photo of 4 generations of Kishka, which is a thing he could not imagine when he was dreaming in the camps, that he would survive, have 4 kids, 9 grandchildren, and 13 grandchildren. This was an impossible dream, and it came to reality. I love this photo very much. 2 months before he passed away, in February 2020, my son and Leonard, his son, we visited my father in his elderly house in Brussels. And this is a photo of the same 4 of us, 4 Kishka. We are all laughing, we are all happy. And I think that this book changed me. This book changed me because today I can't even define myself as a post-trauma of the Holocaust, because I don't feel anymore any post-trauma. I think that the work on the book was so deep that I'm free of it. But that was very important in my construction as a man. As Yael said, in May, there will be the first screening of a movie, animated movie called My Father's Secret, freely adapted in France from my book. I haven't seen it yet. I hope I could go to the first screening of it. This is one frame of the movie. It's really, when I watch it, I recognize my father, my mother, myself, my brother and sisters. It's very well done. The stories, huge parts of my book are in it, but there are also different parts that were added, adaptating is changing things. When my father passed away, he was in Brussels and I was here in Israel, but my sister that lives in Brussels told me that he was wearing a t-shirt that I drew for his 90th birthday. I drew him sleeping on the shade of a tree, which is the family tree. And this is what he actually wore on the moment that he passed away. And the second book, Falafel with Hot Sauce, is about my life in Israel and my aliyah. But this is another story for another webinar that we will have in other circumstances. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michal. I normally would have apologized that we didn't stick to our time plan, but it's just too important to listen and listen and listen. And I don't have enough words to express my thanks to our three speakers. They went way beyond what was first envisioned as just 12 minutes about doing the books, but thank you, thank you. Do you know that we do have, and in some ways we are at time. We can continue, we can all continue for another 15 minutes easily and invite the rest of our kind audience to stay with us, just so that we have enough time to how about we take 5 minutes for sharing the panelists' responses to each other. Let's start again. Karen, you've listened to your fellow panelists now and to yourself. Amazing in-depth journeys and odysseys. So the Odyssey is not just the thousands and thousands of mileage and hours and years that went into creating your creations, and really do repair, do the job of repair, and share what it's like to do the job of repair with the audience, so they can participate too. But I would like to just say, take 1 minute each. Karen, what did you feel? What do you think after you heard the other, yourself and Michal and Michal?
So for me, the very process of doing this panel is restorative. Mm-hmm. It is repairing. It is to hear from each of you your story and think about the intersections is very meaningful to me. Michal, when you talk about, you know, how there's people who say, oh, I thought it was just my father in Uzbekistan. Mm-hmm. You know, that experience, which I've had with my book as well, to me, that is part of what makes this the hard part of the work of the last 10 years so worthwhile. I feel that there is a community and a giving and a helping other people in that. And Michal, when you talk about, you know, trying to be perfect and the responsibility, I so identified with that, that piece of it in particular, of going to college and feeling like I had to succeed, I had to be good, and being in a group actually with other children who were second generation, and that shared sense of responsibility and striving for perfection, and having a father who spoke only much later. I mean, I shared so much of that with you, and I I'm just very, very moved by both of your stories and the bigger ways that those stories radiate out. So thank you.
And Michal?
Yeah, this is fantastic. I think I was thinking about the last thing Michal said about it doesn't have post-trauma anymore. I mean, I really feel the same way, which doesn't mean that it's, I mean, I'm engaging. For example, I have this, now I'm in a kind of semi-war with Polish revisionism, Holocaust revisionism. So I published a big article in Polish newspaper. And so it's not all kind of like, we're all happy family and everything is great. But there's something about the knowledge itself. You just know what happened. It's not this enormous, amorphous cloud that you live in. That's very, it just puts everything in proportion. You just understand it, and I mean, you don't understand it exactly, but it just doesn't have these monstrous this proportions. So in that sense, I think it's I connected with what Michal said. I too, I mean, as you were talking, Michal, I was thinking, could I have published this book if my father was alive? And especially the very more intimate details about my childhood and the scenes that we had together. And I guess I would have, but it would have been another thing. And at the same time, it's to me tragic that my father didn't have the opportunity to, I mean, he died without a story, and he died anonymous, and he died a person who was connected to who had lost that past and had no, he's never been recognized. Also, the people that I write about have never received German reparations. So they hadn't, so in a way, in terms of Israeli society, they're like, it created the two-tier system of survivors, even in that respect. And Karen, yeah, I mean, we already spoke about the fact that there's so many similarities, and that we ourselves have been shaped by this past without knowing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Karen, when I heard your story, I had a flashback, because it happened to me so many times that I met people whose parents were liberated, one of the two parents, from Buchenwald on the same April 1145.
Yeah.
I was interviewed on Israeli TV by a famous journalist in my book when it was published in Hebrew. And in the making up room, we had a small talk before we went to the set. And he said to me, I read your book. My father was liberated from Buchenwald the same day. So this is absolutely incredible. So many common things that connect people together. And I wanted to say you, Michal, that I was very touched by what you said in the end of your presentation about other people who have suffered. You have shown the Iranian and also others. I was in France just before the COVID in January 20, in a high school that had a seminar on genocides of the 20th century. And there were people talking about the Rwanda, the Tutsi genocide, and others on the Armenian genocide. And I think that, is there a lesson that I kept from my own story, is this sensibility to the suffering of others, not only to the Jewish Holocaust. I'm not a Jewish paranoiac, okay? And I'm very sensible to the suffering of others, and this is the way I cartoon as a political cartoonist. So if I look at my work, I think that my family story and the way I grew up and the book that I made make me a different cartoonist. I'm not nasty. I try not to hurt, to be funny and to be sophisticated, and I have a lot of compassion to people suffering, and I think it comes somewhere from there. I'm convinced.
I would like to just acknowledge the 3 questions that were put in the question and answer section. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in the you know, the chat is full of expressions of appreciations of what you've shared. Thank you all for that. And yes, I saw a request for the panelists to share their emails. Karen and Michal already have. I don't know, Michelle, if you would like to, but if you do,
Yes.
please add it to the chat, because people are full of questions and want to remain connected.
Okay.
Faye, you asked, saying to Michal at the time, or to others, you said, you showed the younger picture of your father and later explained that you were able to reclaim emotionally and psychologically with some of his past, happier past, it seems. Please elaborate on what is necessary for you to arrive at this emotional point. Thank you all for your stories. Well, dear Faye, you're absolutely right. It's an extraordinary challenge. And you have actually seen how each one, and heard how each one of the panelists have labored to do just that. But so this is one question, if either one of you want to address, we have only 2 more. Olga from Russia says, thanks the speakers for their family stories. As a teacher, she writes, what is the most suitable way to speak about the Holocaust and Nazi forced labor with school students? Again, it takes us a little outside the focus of the panel, but if you want to say, this was the second question put to you, to the panelists, and Michel Zafrani asks Michal, would you expand on the distinction between Sarid and Nitzol? Michal addressed that distinction in terms of how in Israel the word survivor is called Sarid. In English, it gets the heroic survivor definition. Excellent question. we should have a webinar on each one of these questions. So if you want to and would like to respond, please go ahead. Let's start with Michel. We'll do it backwards now.
Okay. Okay. So no, the Hebrew distinction between the 2 words is very interesting, because the will of the survivors to be called Sored is not long time ago it happened, because Nitzol has been saved, okay, as if they just waited to be saved, and Sored is someone who struggled to survive, and you had to struggle to survive. And actually, I remember I knew some of my father's friends who were liberated with him from Buchenwald. The 3 who lived in France, and I met them a few times in my life. And they all told me that when they came back, nobody was looking at them. They came back with their, prisoners' pyjama, if I can say so. And no one was interested in their story. No one was ready to listen to them. And they were just numbers, okay? And I think that the same happened in the Israeli society. Absolutely the same. You know, Israel was busy. It was not Israel yet at the liberation. It was still Palestine. But when the state was created and after survivors emigrated to Palestine, they were considered Jews of the old world, okay, by the natives or by those who wanted to build a new country of free Jews. That was not simple to be a survivor in any society. And so this distinction in the language, I'm not sure it exists in other language, because survivor it englobes everything in it. It's a good word, and this is the name of Maus, A Survivor's Tale. This is absolutely that. Okay, that was about the terminology. Okay,
Michal?
First to the first question about what it takes to, I think I can talk about myself only. And I think it's a combination of intellectual, emotional, psychological labor. And so it's a process that I feel like in all of these things we're interconnected. I mean, I often talk, because I teach courses also on representations of trauma, and psychologists often talk about what is unknown, the fragment. And I actually say, I wanted to know, I wanted to get beyond, because the fact that we talk about the unknown a lot of times is because we don't want to know, because we can't go there, not because the information is not there. So the process of overcoming that and knowing and spending time with people, and it is. I mean, I actually had this distinct moment after many years when I read my father's testimony that he gave in 1943. I could almost hear it. I could hear the Yiddish, even though I actually never studied Yiddish, but I could hear it. And so this is I think what this journey takes, and it's pretty long, I think, for me anyway. It takes a while, because in the beginning, I think you have the photos, but the photos are meaningless. They're not cathected with anything, with any emotion, or they're just dead. And then the photos somehow come alive after this process. To the second question about Sored and basis survivor, I know that, you know, I just have a bit of an aversion to narratives of heroism, and because again, I think in my story, on the one hand, people were amazing, and on the other hand, it's very arbitrary. The narrative is very arbitrary, and the fact that you are caught in the eye of the storm of this horrible event is in itself arbitrary. And so, you know, the fact that you remained alive is, I think, the most important thing. And I don't like it when it's sort of glorified. Like I would rather to have not had to write this book, and I would have rather for my father not to have gone through this experience. And so I resist that. I wanted to say, in terms of Michal's comment, I also feel that this journey has made me, you know, more empathic. You know, I even have empathy to my colleagues at the university, much more, I think, than I did before. So, you know, maybe I'll stop there, and then people can also feel free to write me, and I'll answer them.
Exactly.
You know.
Karen, take the last word.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. In terms of the first question, you know, what it took, I think I'd say two things. One is enormous emotional support from my husband, my children, the dearest of friends, and others. I couldn't have done this without the emotional support for all those, as I said, emotional punches in the gut that I encountered along the way. The second piece I would say is, for me, there was this fine line between, and I don't mean living in the past, but being like enveloped and soaked in the in the past and yet being in the present. It was this ongoing back and forth. And I would wake up at 3 a.m. to write. I feel like my grandmother's spirit was almost waking me up, and that was my time. And then there would be the day. And so for me, that was a piece of the emotional healing, I think, was the holding both, but not too much in the past, finding that way. To the second question, I obviously there's age appropriate at different ages. I don't know the answer to that. I know I'm going to address an 8th grade class, interestingly enough, Michal, when they're reading Mouse. I'm going to come in as well and speak with them and work with the teachers on how to bring both pieces together. And on the last question, since I don't speak Hebrew, I can't speak to that, but it does evoke for me in a favorable review from the Jewish Book Council for my book. The first paragraph says, the reviewer marvels that I wrote this book, and it's about survivor's guilt in a way for somebody who wasn't a survivor, meaning my father. And I know there's a lot of conversation, what makes a survivor? What is it, somebody who was in the camps and that is a survivor, or are other people considered such? So, that raised for me, when I read that in the review, I was like, wow, language is very meaningful. And we have to be mindful of that. So anyway, I'll close with that.
I had two sorts of reaction to my book. One was of people who wrote me, thank you for having tell my story. Okay, so my story was also their story. This is why I called my book Second Generation and not Kishka's Wonderful Story. Okay, and the other one is that I had some people of my generation who told me that my book helped them understanding better their own parents. Because the process that I passed through, and it took me 10 years of hesitation and of postponing the project because I wasn't sure I was ready for it, or I had enough courage to face it. Actually, they did not do that work. Not everyone does that work. And somehow my book made this possible to them to understand their parents better and also themselves better. And this is a thing I could not think about when I did my book. I did it really for myself. And when it was published and some people read it, told me, actually you did a therapy. And because I don't like this word, I said, no, it was not a therapy, because for a therapy you pay. And for my book, I was paid. So it's not a therapy. This is just, I was just kidding. It healed all the wounds of the family. And I think that if I can, in one sentence, sum up what I did, I opened the wounds. Right. I healed it, and then I closed it. The scarf is the book. And I did my best to make a beautiful scarf. This is the way I can sum up the work I did. Okay.
Thank you. Now, people keep asking questions at this point when we are way over time, but I think it's important to note the question. And this is from my very, very close, beloved friend. Jacqueline Murakatete is a survivor of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. And she has 2 young kids now, 5-year-old and 1-year-old. Any specific advice based on your experience on how I can minimize the trauma, pressure to excel, please me as my children grow up? And also when you think it's the most appropriate age to share a version of my story. My 5-year-old is already asking about my parents, her grandparents, who were killed in the genocide, because my husband still has his parents, and she started asking me where my parents are. Thank you again for your powerful words, Jacqueline. God bless you for asking the question, and we are all here to look into that. But if any of you wants to add, wants to take a one sentence answer, please do. It is part of what runs through my mind when I listen to all of you, is that in Judaism, knowledge is not only responsibility, but knowledge is liberation. So said one of my intellectual grandfathers, Sigmund Freud. Two, the title of our webinar is extremely meaningful. It's not only cohering, right? Just like Michal said, putting everything together, connecting the dots. It's cohering the story. It's not just having a terrifying, amorphous being that you have no emotional, intellectual, factual access to. So cohering the Holocaust stories to repair the world. The issue is not, this is my deepest belief, all these years of working in this field, that children of survivors of any trauma, actually just children, want to repair the world for the parents and for themselves. And when I was discussing the title with Michal, she said to me, but the whole world, and she sent me that review article. So part of your request, Jacqueline, is part of us doing what in Judaism and in Israel we are supposed to do too, is a mitzvah, mitzion tetzeh Torah. That means from Zion, from Israel, knowledge will be shared with the world to repair the world. So, Jacqueline, your question is magnificent. And each one of you, please, one sentence.
I'll say, because I teach classes on representations of trauma, I would say one sentence: interconnected traumas. I teach, when I teach, I teach at City University. There are not very many Jewish students. I taught Primo Levi a few years ago. A student came to me, said to me, it's the first time I understand what being a slave meant. Mm-hmm. And I'm I think we have to think about the problems of analogies, but I think, so it's not analogous, but something in that experience helped him understand. I saw my father cry my whole life once. It was when he watched the film The Deer Hunter, which is about POWs so it had nothing to do with Holocaust. I think somehow maybe for children to start them off, that's a little bit easier.
Okay. When I presented my book in my hometown in Liège, in the community center of the Jewish community, there were two women from Rwanda in the audience. And after my lecture, I was asked the question that Jacqueline asked. I was signing my book at a table, and she came to me and she said, I have two little children. Do I have to tell them? And I said that I think that at each age, you have to find words to say things. Keeping silence is like lying. And you have to find a way, the words, first of all, to be sure that they want to know. We were not asking questions when we were kids. I had the feeling that there's a minefield around my father. Everywhere I would step, something will explode and he will die in front of my eyes. So I was afraid to ask questions. This is why I was watching his book. So I think that you can say when your kids is 5 or 6, that they have suffered a lot. And one day you will tell a little more. And one day they will grow up and ask more questions. this is better than not saying, because in my family experience, I know that silence does not protect. I know it.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Michelle. Karen, your last
And
one.
I would just agree with what's been said. And I was the kid that asked the questions, and I would get an answer. And I think answering, as has been said, in an age appropriate way. And I think trust your heart. You're going to find the right way. You will find the right way to say it at the right age. And whether they're asking or not, bring them along. That's what I would say.
And Jacqueline, for me, you know that April, which is Genocide Month, is coming up. April 7 is the anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, the very tragic anniversary. And how about we organize a webinar, our center with your project and whoever else related to that, and bring up this question. How do you feel about that? You let me know. Okay, I want to thank these amazing three panelists for being you, for taking the courage to explore terrifying histories, for loving your parents so much that you wanted to not only please them, but heal their stories and make them relevant to you. I hope we will stay in touch for a long, long time and celebrate your future contributions. Not that you can't already be totally proud of your current ones. I want to thank the audience. I don't want to apologize for having taken the time. This is our center. We want people to feel welcome. We want to take the time and make the time to explore issues that are of deep meaning to everyone, whether they acknowledge it or not. Thank you for being with us. The International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma is morally supported by you. Thank you. If you can support us in any other way, that would help us having more of these kind of webinars that are both instructive and moving and inspiring. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you too.
Thank you.
It has been a pleasure to meet you on screen, and also Karen and Michal.
Thank you.
Yes.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Likewise. Thank you so much.